that is effective pre- and post-exposure to accelerate the development of tuberculosis vaccines and ensure that they reach people in need. The European and Developing Countries Clinical Trials Partnership supported the development of a global tuberculosis vaccine R&D roadmap through a highly consultative process involving various stakeholders. Currently, few new products enter the pipeline, and clinical development takes very long due to limitations in our knowledge of protective immune responses, lack of laboratory correlates for protection, and funding constraints amongst others. The roadmap provides a framework for greater coordination of R&D priority issues through an end-to-end perspective, considering all stages of clinical development, as well as issues related to post-licensing implementation, access, and product availability. It lists the major barriers to developing new tuberculosis vaccines, along with the specific actions to overcome these barriers, providing stakeholders with key priorities for tuberculosis vaccine development. A vaccine that is able to halt tuberculosis transmission can be a powerful tool in the effort to eliminate the disease. A coordinated approach is needed to put our efforts and resources together to develop a tuberculosis vaccine and maximize its public health benefit. This roadmap is a major step in that direction. Tuberculosis.
So welcome everyone to this special session for the launch of the global roadmap for TB vaccine R&D. My name is Mark Hatherall. I'm from SATFI, based at the University of Cape Town, and I'll be co-chairing this session with my colleague Matteo Zignol from the Global Health or the Global TB Program at WHO. Before we kick off, we have one or two housekeeping notes, which you'll see on your screen. This session is being recorded and will be available on the EDCTP website. You'll notice that your audio and video functions in Zoom should have been disabled, and we'll ask you, please, if you have questions, and questions are encouraged, please to post those in the Q&A in your Zoom screen. If we do not get to all of the questions, there will be an opportunity for the speakers to follow up on questions after this session. So this is a particularly important session. I think if we reflect on the major advances in our field in TB vaccine development, the most recent advances, and I'm thinking particularly about the efficacy signals for BCG revaccination and M72. Those results were published in 2018. So it was seen that perhaps we as a field need a better mechanism, not just to rebound from our challenges, but to leverage our successes and to further accelerate TB vaccine development. So we'll be hearing from three speakers in this session who will introduce the roadmap and speak to its impact and importance. And these talks will be followed by a panel discussion from a diverse group of stakeholders. And then we'll be hearing from the Executive Director of EDCTP, Dr. Michael Makanga, who will close. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my co-chair, Matteo, to introduce the first speakers. Matteo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thanks a lot for joining this important event. There's a very large number of colleagues and connected. I'll start immediately by introducing the first speaker, who is Professor Frank Koblenz. Professor Koblenz is Professor of Global Health at the Department of Global Health at the Amsterdam University. He is a clinical epidemiologist and has been working in TB research throughout his career. He has been the engine behind the development of the global TB vaccine R&D roadmap. And he will speak on the roadmap and on the actions and enabling considerations. Over to you, Frank.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Matteo. Good afternoon to all of you. I hope you can see my slides now.
Yes.
Yeah. So let me move to the presentation mode. So it's a great pleasure to introduce here today the TB vaccine R&D roadmap, and particularly focusing on the actions and enabling conditions. But before going into those details, I wanted to briefly touch on the purpose of this roadmap and the process by which we got to it. So the purpose was to develop a global roadmap for research and development of TB vaccines that provides global stakeholders with key actionable priorities that could help guide their actions, and to list the short-term objectives and the long-term strategic objectives for global TB vaccine development, and all this with a focus on affordable vaccines for use in low and middle-income countries. The architecture, if you will, so the way this roadmap was set up is that we started sort of looking at the end. So where should this all lead to? And that is the development goals, or the product profile characteristics as they've been defined by the World Health Organization for 3 different types of vaccine: a safe, effective, and affordable vaccine for adolescents and adults, an affordable TB vaccine for neonates and infants with improved safety and efficacy compared to BCG, and a therapeutic vaccine to improve TB treatment outcomes. And we categorized the research and development actions that would be needed into the 3 themes that you see on top: diversifying the pipeline, accelerating clinical development, and ensuring public health impact. And then also defined 3 categories of enabling conditions: funding, open science, and stakeholder engagement, all needed to make this happen. And we then defined actions for each of these that were grouped according to being needed in the short term, up to 2 years, the medium term, 2 to 5, and in the long term, 5 years and beyond. And also defined the interdependencies between those actions. The process was very inclusive. You see here a long list of various stakeholder constituencies that were involved in establishing this roadmap. I won't read out all of them. The process was starting with stakeholder interviews, and then a workshop, a very interactive workshop that was co-organized with WHO. By the way, this whole process was done in close collaboration with the World Health Organization, both with its vaccine and biologicals department and with the Global TB department, the Global TB program. The objectives of this stage were to define the key barriers to TB vaccine development, the knowledge gaps and actions to overcome these barriers, the prioritization, interdependencies and timing of these actions, and then the supportive conditions needed to, again, make that all happen. And the process was then that there were several iterations of the draft roadmap that all these various stakeholders had the opportunity to comment on. It was then submitted for review to the Product Development for Vaccines Advisory Committee of WHO, PDVAC, and around the same time to the Scientific Advisory Board of EDCTP. The comments that we received from those resulted in a third draft that was put up for public consultation by the end of last year, and then it was finalized, and that resulted in the product that you've seen now and that we are discussing now. And this infographic basically shows you the entire roadmap. And it shows on top the R&D themes, below that the major action lines. These are basic and translational science for diversifying the pipeline, animal models and clinical trials for accelerating clinical development, and epidemiology and modeling, and research to ensure optimal implementation under the heading of ensuring public health impact. And below that, you see the 3 key enabling conditions along with their major action lines. I will briefly touch on each of these without going too much into detail for sake of time. But I will also, at least for the R&D action lines, I will briefly summarize the key barriers and the key questions that we identified and that this roadmap, amongst other things, tries to address. So starting with the basic and translational science, the key barriers that were identified were that there are relatively few candidates in preclinical and early clinical development, that the approach to vaccine development that has been taken this far is considered too narrow, with its emphasis on stimulating classical CD4 positive Th1 cells, and that only a limited set of candidate TB antigens are currently considered. They're all known Mycobacterium tuberculosis virulence factors. So that results into these R&D actions that you see there below, listed there below, the central mechanisms and biomarkers of protection, on new approaches to vaccine discovery, improved vaccine formulation and delivery, and a controlled human infection model. With regard to animal models, the key barrier is really the lack of relevant, validated preclinical models that predict infection and disease in humans, which basically limits effective down selection of candidates for clinical development, so to move from discovery into the clinical development stage. And that implies a need for diverse fit-for-purpose animal models that can predict and replicate findings in humans, and that would result from back translation from clinical studies, and in particular, trials that have shown efficacy signals. The R&D actions with regard to animal models are around optimizing animal models and comparing vaccine candidates within and across animal models. With regard to clinical trials, the key barrier is the lack of clinical evidence to support decisions to move a candidate forward through the clinical development pipeline, so from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3. And that is mainly because of a lack of an agreed laboratory or more than one agreed laboratory correlates of protection. And the implication for that is that we need these large phase 2 and phase 3 trials of very long duration that have prevention of disease as clinical efficacy endpoint. Well, obviously there are alternative endpoints being tried out, if you will, prevention of infection, prevention of a recurrence. But the problem that we're faced with is that we basically don't know how well they predict prevention of disease in the end, which is the main endpoint for licensure. So that leads to these R&D actions around establishing better trial endpoints, around correlates of protection, around trial harmonization and design, and around developing trial site capacity. Then with regard to epidemiology and modeling, the key questions here are, first, what is the likely need of countries for a new TB vaccine that is to be used in adults and adolescents, and what are the associated considerations when that vaccine is added to the national immunization program? So basically, the value proposition for a new tuberculosis vaccine. Second, what is the national and global demand for a new TB vaccine? That's very important to stimulate manufacturers to enter into the market and prepare and scale up vaccine production. And third, what is the new TB vaccine's effectiveness, safety, and impact when it's being rolled out? So it's basically the post-licensure question. So the R&D actions here are around country-specific data and projections and around post-licensure studies. And then finally, with regard to research to ensure optimal implementation, these were the three questions that were identified. What are feasible and effective strategies for vaccine implementation among adults and adolescents? How should vaccine implementation be integrated with ongoing TB prevention efforts, for example, preventive treatment, that is now being increasingly recommended? And what are the determinants of uptake and acceptance? And how should barriers to vaccine uptake be addressed? And that leads to R&D actions in these two categories: health system conditions for vaccine introduction and barriers and enablers of vaccine uptake. And again, I'm not listing all the actions that are listed. You can find them in the roadmap that you have been sent. With regard to the key enabling conditions, starting with funding, the first one under funding is to attract new investments in TB vaccine R&D, a very important one, by developing a comprehensive global value proposition, by broadening the funding base with governments, philanthropy, and donors, and by attracting new entrants in research and into this market. Second, to develop innovative financing mechanisms for TB vaccine R&D by establishing partnerships for joint funding of trials, and by customizing funding calls to the clinical development pathway. And finally, to create mechanisms that attract investments in early stages of development by market shaping to reduce commercial uncertainty and managing intellectual property. With regard to open science, to promote timely and open access of data, specimens, and results by promoting open access publication and open access databases, by promoting sharing of biospecimens, and by establishing publicly searchable patent databases. And two, to create a mechanism for coordinating open science by establishing a platform for data sharing and by developing and coordinating systems and procedures. And then finally, with regard to stakeholder engagement, to create a supportive environment for TB vaccines by increasing political commitment, by advocating for development and uptake, by harmonizing and fast-tracking regulatory review, and by creating innovative incentives. Second, to overcome barriers to delivery and uptake by engaging with end-user communities and developing approaches for community-level delivery. And finally, to promote TB vaccine and research literacy by creating a global platform for community engagement and training, and by fostering strategic and reciprocal partnerships. And with that, I would like to end, but not before having thanked everyone who's been involved here, long list of stakeholders, but in particular, the people that you see listed here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. First of all, for the huge amount of work that you and your team have put over the past 1.5 years. This has been a very inclusive and thorough process. And thanks a lot also for the very clear and informative presentation. I think we can, yes, move on to the next speaker, but let me please remind the attendees, colleagues, to put your questions on the chat. We will have time after the presentation for a very lively discussion. Thanks again. I will now introduce the second speaker of our meeting today. He is Professor Wille Annekam, who is the director of the African Health Research Institute in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. And Professor Annekam is a very well-known global expert in TB vaccine R&D. And today he will talk about opportunities for TB vaccine R&D. Thanks for joining, and over to you, Bill.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm not sure if my video is working, but anyway, so let's move straight into the presentation. So this is of course a fantastic document that has been generated, and I want to thank especially the people that have been implemented, who have been central in doing this. But for me today, I think the organizers gave me a little bit of an open slate to give my opinions and personal opinions, and so I thought I'd highlight 5 things today. Okay, so very many of these are very, very personal. So this was taken on Thursday, just a few kilometers from where I live. It looks like a postcard, but this is where one can actually think then about these kinds of things. And I want to also just thank at this stage other people, many people, especially at SATFI, at the Gates Foundation, but many other people that have been instrumental in thought processes that are going to come up now. And it's going to be no surprise, I guess, to everyone that COVID-19 has to feature prominently in what we talk about today, and linking on in very much with the presentation by Helen Rees earlier today. So if we talk about the obvious, we know that TB was discovered in 1882, at least announced then. And we now have BCG, only a vaccine that's been 100 years old. And there's only really been 3 pivotal events, clinical events, I think, in the TB vaccine development space since in 2013, when MVA wasn't shown to protect against childhood TB, 2018, when BCG revaccination looked as if it protects against reinfection or infection by TB, and then the really important M72 results in 2018 and 19. And this is the obvious. It was announced on 7 January 2020 that the SARS-CoV-2 was discovered, and by December there were 2 FDA-approved vaccines. In fact, many more have been approved by many stringent regulatory authorities. So why is this? And I think perhaps this is a little bit of a luck on behalf of COVID. The immunity that we thought would work does seem to work, and we know that in contrast, tuberculosis is a very complex organism that has been without us for years and years, tens of thousands of years, and during those tens of thousands of years, a very complex host pathogen interaction has emerged that we're still trying to decipher and still trying to get on top of it. So we have a more difficult task, I think, than that of COVID. So that's why this roadmap is extraordinarily important. But the first thing I want to mention is that developing such a strategy and such a roadmap is relatively easy. We all like developing strategies, but how are you going to implement it? That's the really important part. And I think for me, the very next step is how the global community is going to mobilize to implementing this, because there have been many such efforts over the ages. So for example, 10 years ago, this was published, a blueprint for TB vaccine development. It sounds very, very similar if you look at the key areas to progress, which is creativity in research and discovery, correlative immunity biomarkers, clinical trials issues, rational selection, then advocacy, community acceptance, and funding, all the components that we just heard about. So I think the very important first point is that it cannot just be another document that we've done and we've signed off on. There needs to be an implementation strategy, and for me, that implementation strategy has to be modified by our experience with COVID. The second point I want to talk about is perhaps to highlight this issue. Develop a comprehensive global value proposition for TB vaccines. So, and the point I want to make is that we need to recognize TB as a global crisis. We don't. I don't think the academic community does this. I don't think many other stakeholders do this. And there are many, many stakeholders that are important here. And without doing what has been done for COVID and seeing it as a really an incredible crisis, we are not going to get to a TB vaccine or interventions in tuberculosis. So these are, for example, new COVID deaths in 3 countries that I've just selected. And if you look at India, for example, and look at the average number of deaths a day in India, it is more than they've had in the entire epidemic to date in terms of confirmed COVID deaths. For Indonesia, also more than they have had for by far the majority of the period that COVID has caused deaths. And same also for South Africa. But why do these countries not regard these as crises, whereas COVID became a crisis? So I think we need our advocates, and we all need to become advocates, need to use these kinds of pictures, which I've always resisted in using in presentations, but we now need to mobilize and finally get the message out there that this is an absolute crisis. If we look at deaths in the world from COVID, and we just look at the number of deaths from TB per day, it's virtually, for the majority of the epidemic, is virtually the same as the number of COVID deaths, yet it's not a crisis. And I don't think this kind of chart for the world is going to convince the rich countries actually that TB is going to be a crisis. So that brings me then to the second point, the whole point about funding. And there's very beautiful descriptions of what the approaches should be to getting more funding into the TB space. But my thoughts are these, is that the primary thing then would be to advocate the crisis. And I think that's going to be easier for the LMIC countries, but not easy for the so-called developed world. And to get these funders mobilized, I think we really have to emphasize how TB vaccine research could advance other fields. And again, and I think creating more funding, for example, is the only way in which we're going to get academics mobilized, for example, into the TB space. Now, just again to state the obvious, the amount that's been spent on COVID vaccine R&D, 78.6 billion. And you can see that 70% of the research came from these 4 constituencies. And these are the constituencies that obviously may be important for TB vaccine, for TB R&D funding. So TB R&D funding needs about 2.5 billion a year, pittance compared to COVID, but we only get about 1 billion a year, and about 15% of that is then spent on TB vaccines. So it's minute amounts of money. So how can we say we want to be, like Luchika said this earlier today, we want to do exactly what COVID vaccines have done if we do not spend on this? And yet this slide from Mike Frick is really very instructive. So why do we have these COVID vaccines? Because they've learned, especially from HIV vaccine R&D, and as Tony Fauci has said here, everything we do with every other pathogen spins off things that we've learned with TB, with HIV, and we could say the same for TB. And this is the investment in TB vaccines is really what we should say would benefit other fields, such as the cancer field, the chronic disease field, etc. So that brings me then to the next area, which is really the big themes and how to address them. And again, I think we really have to untangle the experience from COVID-19 vaccines to steer TB vaccine discovery, development, and implementation. And this has sort of happened since the roadmap has been developed. And so that's why the implementation side of this roadmap is going to be absolutely critical. I guess I'll skip that for time, but there are many vaccines here, and there's just an extraordinary amount of new knowledge that can immediately be applied to TB vaccines. And this is right from the beginning of how to design a vaccine, the manufacturing, CMC, novel clinical trial approaches, such as what Helen Rees spoke about earlier, learning about adverse events of adenovirus-based vaccines, which we never knew about, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's in the implementation phase, it's really our duty now to kind of see how we can decipher this knowledge and immediately apply it and not start from the beginning again in TB vaccines. And this applies also for delivery. As you know, we will ultimately have to deliver vaccines to adolescents and adults. So now is the time, in LMIC especially, where we roll out new vaccines and learn from COVID vaccine experience how this is done, for us to learn how to apply it to TB vaccines. But ultimately, we are extremely good in TB vaccines at working at the snail space. So this is the early development of M72, fantastic vaccine that we've got now. We now in we are now nearly 20 years later, and we still do not have a phase 3 for this vaccine. We'll just have to do things differently in the future. We'll just have to accelerate our development. And things such as a manufacturing constraint should not hold us up from doing a phase 3 trial in the future. Next is then, my final point then relates to open data and mechanisms for coordinating open science. And I feel this is also what has happened in the COVID time, is that we collaborate more and we communicate findings very early, and these findings may not be absolutely perfect. And they're just sufficient for them to be out there and to enter the public domain and for us to start talking about them. And that's a complete turnaround from having to do individualized science and being absolutely perfect and taking months to get your paper published. So, and then there's obviously examples that are going on of how this has worked and advanced the field already, such as CTBD, which was spoken about earlier, and also the TBBI approach of having multiple different groups that work together. But I think these could still be accelerated and enhanced in what gets done. And in South Africa, for example, we formed 2 consortia. One in KwaZulu-Natal, which brought all the COVID researchers together and has been extraordinarily productive. And then as soon as we heard about this new variant, it's also called B1351, and 50 researchers came together and we have weekly meetings to actually discuss this. And I'm asking, why are we having these meetings and why don't we bring all the researchers in South Africa together to talk about tuberculosis? Why aren't we doing this? We don't see it as a crisis. The other way is also rapid communications. The preprints, it's the way of the future. There's no standard submissions anymore, and looking for your data on Twitter and not necessarily in medical magazines. So this is my summary, very personal thought and lessons from COVID-19 for application of the roadmap. The first is develop an implementation plan for the roadmap, adjusting for lessons learned from COVID-19. The second is recognize TB as a global crisis. The third is mobilize funding by advocating the crisis and how TB vaccine research would advance other fields. The fourth is to intentionally learn from the COVID-19 vaccine experience. And the fifth is to collaborate more and communicate sufficient findings early. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Willem, for the really thoughtful presentation and for sharing with us your thoughts about new opportunities that we are seeing now for TB vaccine R&D, lesson learned from the COVID-19 experience, and also for reminding us that we really need to change the way of working. We need to do things in a different way if we want to move rapidly towards our aim, which is the development of effective TB vaccines. I'd like to spend a few minutes now for questions for clarification. We'll have a panel discussion to discuss all the aspects that have been presented, but I'm asking participants if there is any question for clarification to our 2 speakers. And I see someone has his hand raised. I think people should write their question in the chat on the Q&A, please. So, question for clarification. Let me check rapidly to see if there is anything. Maybe I can start with, there are a number of questions, but several of them are really bringing us into the discussion already. Let me check. Maybe we can start with a quick question to Frank. It's about the involvement of patients and civil society in the development of the roadmap. You mentioned this point at the beginning of your presentation. If you could elaborate a bit more so that we can bring into this discussion the perspective of communities. And then we move on to other questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Matteo. I think that's a very important point. So what we did right from the start, when we did the interviews, we already involved patient representatives, and actually through our contacts with TAC, they suggested us advocates from India, and we had lengthy discussions with them, and they were part of the interviews. And then we had it was TAC that was invited for the consent workshop, and we had also approached them again, these and a number of other groups separately during the various iterations of the draft. So I think they come up with very important points, I think, because I think thus far, because the TB vaccine development thus far has been so much on the, I think still early development, discovery and early development. I think that the whole point around what should happen once a vaccine is licensed, and how should the post-licensure questions inform discovery and early development, I think we're not yet asked at the level of detail at which they should be asked, and we've tried to do that.
Thank you very much, Frank, for the very clear reply. Just checking if there is another question for clarification. I really do want to go into the discussion now. Yes, it's about, there is a question which I'm going to read, is with the limited biomarkers and known immunogens for TB. Does the roadmap include any potential vaccine candidates? It is a roadmap tailored to potential vaccine candidates, or it is a document which is, covering, multiple.
It is deliberately agnostic with regard to products. Of course, there have been, and I think Willem just highlighted them. There have been some very important developments lately with M72, with BCG revaccination, in the sense that they showed efficacy signals. But the roadmap is really deliberately product agnostic. So all candidates should sort of fit in the story.
Thank you very much. And as I see, maybe another question of clarification. Yes, maybe again, maybe for Frank, is it's a question that addressed to the WHO Global TB program, so I should answer this question, but I put it to you, Frank, because I think the question is about, what about the issue of open access and sharing? How we ensure that we have a system to share information? Is this something that is discussed in the roadmap? Then I will answer from the WHO point of view later, but it's mainly to see whether in the roadmap there is a provision of, the issue of open access and data sharing.
Yes, definitely. So there is a whole section devoted to it, and it comes down to a number of things. It comes down to, as Willem already outlined, the importance of open access publication, and the earlier the better, as we have learned with COVID-19. And I really liked his slide with the arrow going back. It's really a turning point, I think, and the TB vaccine field should follow that as well. Another one is really to be open about negative results, particularly in animal models. I think the field needs to know if a particular thing doesn't work in a particular animal model. I think that's a tremendously important thing to do. But also very important is to be able to share specimens. And now, especially now that we are seeing efficacy signals in trials, those specimens that have been collected in these trials will be tremendously important for discovery of correlates of protection. So, and there is a whole, and there are a number of subsections devoted to that, how that could potentially be done, because it shouldn't be first comers here. It should be really which groups have the best ideas for doing this. So you should have some sort of an independent panel that can then decide on the utilization of those, by now I think very important. So so obviously those samples are small in terms of volume. So they will be very precious. So it will be important that it basically goes to feed the best ideas.
Thanks a lot, Frank, for the very clear answer. Yeah, maybe I think the last question on clarification, and then I think we should move on to the discussion, because most of the questions I see on the chat are really, for the panel discussion. A question to Willem, it's about funding, and you have shown us the huge difference between, COVID-19 R&D, TB budget. Compared to the TB R&D vaccine budget. And the question is, which are the main difficulties in mobilizing funding? It's a very, very general question, but can you tell us, from your experience, which are the main issues that we need to address?
Yeah, I want to say up front that I'm no expert in this area, and I do not know how to mobilize funding, except that I know that we need to do it if we want to get anywhere with TB vaccines. And so my impressions are just, and these are again very personal impressions, is that it's all about a value proposition and how we actually propose it to the funders, to different stakeholders. But with that, it requires a more global mobilization, I think, of all kinds of stakeholders, and especially the civil society, of the public, to become aware of this crisis that's going on. I don't think this is going to happen in high-income countries, but it can definitely happen in low and middle-income countries. And us as researchers would definitely have to be part of this effort to get this mobilization going. I think once the roadmaps is available to everyone, I think reading that section is very useful in actually learning about what are suggested approaches. But even those, I think, would have to be translated to direct actions. I'm sorry for this wishy-washy effort, but I as a researcher, I don't actually know the answer, but I do think that we should all contribute to this.
Thank you very much, Willem. And maybe a follow-up question on this issue. I think this goes to Frank. There is a question that I'm saying during the development of the roadmap and during the consultation that you did, to reach this point, did you get any insights to reasons for funders not to be, fully engaged or not to accomplish on the monetary commitments made in the past? Did you come up with any insights on this issue?
Well, actually, what I think gives important insights is again the recent report by the Action Group on the funding landscape in TB research, and that's also the slide that Willem just showed, where you see that TB vaccine research is underfunded. That there are two funders that take up most of the funding. That's the NIH and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I think EDCTP is really moving there now as well. There are two, I think, important funders that to me seem lacking. One is obviously industry, but we don't know everything that happens in industry. I mean, that's not completely. I think that hasn't all been shared with tech. But the other one is countries, and particularly middle-income countries, because I think Willem rightly said that we shouldn't immediately expect rich countries to sort of jump in, because this isn't a crisis, at least not a crisis perceived as being a crisis for the rich countries. But I think for the middle-income countries, this is a quite different story, and somehow I'm missing there the funding from governments, middle-income countries that could play an important role here. So I think here is really advocacy work to be done, because I think the value proposition can be made towards those governments, and I think and this is really where, as Willem said, where researchers and advocates have to march hand in hand.
Thank you so much, Frank. I think we can now close this quick session on question for clarification, and want to thank again Professor Kobelens and Professor Annekon for intervening today actually, to this symposium. I now hand over to my co-chair, Professor Mark Hatterley, who will walk us through the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Matteo. I must also add that our third speaker, Ms. Blasina Kumar, sends her apologies. She has not been able to attend for personal reasons. So we do have a few minutes in hand for additional questions at the end of the panel discussion. So we will now move on to the panel discussion. We have 5 panelists representing diverse stakeholder groups. Our panelists are Dr. Videlis Nduba from the Kenya Medical Research Institute, or KEMRI, representing the research community. Dr. Anne Ginsberg, who leads the TB vaccine development efforts at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, representing funders. We have Dr. Birgitta Geersing from the Department of Immunization, Vaccines and Biologicals, or IVB, at the WHO, representing policymakers. Mr. Rajinder Suri from the Developing Countries Vaccine Manufacturers Network, representing vaccine manufacturers. And then finally, Dr. Agnès Saint-Ramond from the EMA, representing regulators. And we will put 2 specific questions to our panel, and we will tackle each question in turn. And we will allow each panelist a few minutes to give their perspective on behalf of their stakeholder community. And then we will have some time at the end, as I said, for Q&A and also further discussion of the initial talks. So Fidelis, can I ask you to kick off and speak to how will this roadmap be useful to you and the researcher community going forward?
Thank you, Mark. So this roadmap sets out priority areas for research and informs investigators where they can plug into TB vaccine trials. I also found it quite useful in guiding investigators in setting up access to potential trial populations and acquiring relevant clinical data to inform the planning of TB vaccine trials. I think it's also good for guiding engagement with regulators, especially many developing country settings are becoming very sensitive to the issue of material transfer agreements and moving specimens across borders. And one of the things it proposes is biobanking protocols that would allow best research and use of specimens. So again, engaging the ethics bodies and other stakeholders to buy into that. And it would allow stakeholder engagement in terms of looking at communities that would participate in these trials, various interest groups, agencies in the ministry, in government, like the Ministry of Health TB control programs, and allow really governments to prioritize resources that would go towards acquisition of a potentially new efficacious vaccine.
Thanks very much, Fidelis. As I said earlier, we're going to move quickly from panelist to panelist and allow questions at the end. So let's move on now to Dr. Anne Ginsberg. And how will the roadmap be useful to the funder community?
Thanks, Willem. I think thinking about this as a funder, the roadmap's useful in a number of ways. Maybe most importantly, it sends a message to the funders as well as to others that the experts in the field have a clear view of what's needed to be done to accelerate TB vaccine R&D. So that's probably helpful to all the funders and especially helpful to those that don't have a lot of internal TB vaccine specific, technically knowledgeable staff of their own, right? It gives them a clear path to follow and a way of deciding amongst all the proposals that come their way, you know, which have the experts' view of likely to really be impactful and make a difference. It also helps to build consensus amongst the funders, not that all the funders need to agree, but it expresses the perspectives of many key stakeholders in a coherent way and helps the funders sort of synergize what they're doing and complement each other and see in a bigger picture how what they're doing contributes to the overall effort. Then actually it can also be helpful, frankly, in advocating internally within one's own funding organization for TB vaccine R&D funding compared to all the other priorities of the funder, because it helps inform the other funder organization staff on what's important. Again, sends that clear message of what's needed. And it helps, for example, our funding organization has its own policy advocacy communications staff. So it helps inform them as well in putting out sort of coherent messages and making sure they're funding policy advocacy communications organizations that are aligned with what the broader stakeholder community feels is important to accelerate TB vaccine R&D. And then finally, I think it helps the funders actually develop their sort of terms for their funding agreements with the investigators they fund. And examples of that are data sharing policies, open access policies, sharing of biospecimens, et cetera. So I think those are some of the ways that a roadmap like this can be very helpful to funders.
Thanks very much, Anne. Moving on then to Dr. Geersing. Birgitta, how will this roadmap be useful to to policymakers?
Thanks, Mark. And so first, I'd really like to congratulate the AIGHD and the EDCTP teams for the development and launch of this. This is the first R&D roadmap for TB vaccines. And as Frank said, WHO, both the immunization department and the global TB department, were highly involved and collaborated throughout. We're really delighted to see this come to fruition. The roadmap is so important because of the technical elements and the guidance within it that provide clarity on what's needed, but also, really because of the process that was undertaken to derive the roadmap. On the technical side, as Anne says, it clearly communicates the concrete actions that are needed and the gaps that need to be addressed to advance and accelerate TB vaccines in a measurable and meaningful way. And the roadmap is agnostic. It's relevant for vaccines, whether they be for adolescents and adults or infants, or to improve therapeutic outcomes. And we know that each of these types of vaccines would have a crucial role to play in the control and reduction of TB. So progression of any of them is a significant leap towards addressing this urgent public health priority. And the strength of this roadmap is really that it takes a holistic view from discovery through the multiple stages of development with a line of sight to implementation and impact as its goal. And it's really this end-to-end perspective that's so critical, because in R&D, we're so often focused on the path to licensure, what is needed to get there in terms of data. But the steps beyond that to get to introduction and uptake in high burden countries in multiple regions as quickly as we can are often not so well understood as we approach late stage clinical development. So the sooner that we can start to understand what will also be needed to implement the vaccine, we have a better chance of actually generating some of that data that will support implementation in parallel to late stage clinical development, so that we don't have a delay to implementation post-licensure. I think the second powerful aspect of this roadmap is really the process that was involved in developing it, as Frank outlined. It was truly a broad range of stakeholders that were consulted from the start, really to allow convergence and consensus building around the critical elements that will be needed for success. So not only the technical elements that were outlined, but also the environmental and the enabling conditions that are really crucial to advancing these candidates. And it's this kind of consultative process that fosters a broad understanding of all the elements that need to come into place and how they interact with one another. How do they all fall into sequence? Where are the dependencies? And who's responsible for what? So the result is then that we have improved alignment, and we hope it encourages ownership of the TB R&D roadmap in terms of understanding what is needed. But I think Willem made a really fantastic point about how do we actually implement it now? How do we converge around it? How do we track success and make sure that we're actually living the roadmap? Thanks.
A good point. We'll move on now and leave discussion at the end to Rajinder Suri. Rajinder, how will manufacturers and pharma use the roadmap?
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for this question. Coming from the manufacturer's perspective, I think for any manufacturer to take a decision on whether to develop and manufacture a particular vaccine would depend on several critical factors, including but not limited to the demand scenarios. And the demand scenario is largely based on the disease burden. So as also on the vaccine uptake scenarios, which are going to be feasible or not feasible depending on various conditions. And other than that is the competitive intensity and the competitive advantage that the vaccine offers. So from this perspective, I would say that this roadmap has dealt in with these crucial aspects at length and in depth. and therefore I personally feel is very relevant. In my opinion, again, there are three most crucial factors in TB vaccine development, other than, of course, science and technology, which we have been discussing so far in greater length. And these three are basically accessibility, availability, and affordability of the vaccine. And all these three have been very appropriately dealt in this roadmap, because it does not require a genius to really guess where the burden of the TB disease lies today, for example. We all know that these are largely the LICs and LMICs, that is the low-income countries and low-middle income countries, where the maximum burden of the disease is. And therefore, the equitable access of vaccine to the populations in these countries will be one of the most important aspects that I think has been very, very well dealt with. The second thing which is important is the availability part, and the availability again is a function of capacity, and where is the capacity today. So obviously, COVID vaccine has also given us a very clear message that the capacity is not what is existing, but what can be enhanced. And I must say that the global capacity was 3.5 billion doses for all vaccines put together. And if we consider the flu vaccine also, then probably 5.5 billion. And now in 2021, we are considering somewhere around 10 to 14 billion doses of overall COVID capacity. So this has been done by the vaccine manufacturers all over the world. And the third thing, which is again important, is because this is a disease, as we said, of the LICs and LMICs, and largely the vaccine would be taken up through the public programs. That means through the government funding, so it has to be affordable. And I think this is one of the very, very important aspects which has been dealt with very, very elaborately in the roadmap. And, I distinctly remember that last year when we were amidst the discussion and the COVID had just started, it was on 4th of March in 2020, when we were meeting in Netherlands, and we discussed about this thing. And I asked this question to Frank and the working group, that, there are not many programs which are existing today in developing countries, particularly for adult and elderly or even adolescent immunization programs. So how are we really thinking that this vaccine will reach the masses that we are targeting? And again, thanks to this COVID, that today the whole world is the market, and everybody knows how to reach, where to reach, and which segments to cater to. And even these learnings have been brought out very well in this roadmap. So I say from industry perspective, this has been dealt very well, including the funding mechanisms, whether it is the push mechanism, whether it is the pull mechanism, or even the technology transfers to enhance capacities. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajendra. We move on then finally to Agnès Saint-Ramond. Agnès, how will the regulatory community use the roadmap?
Thank you. First, let me congratulate AIGHD and the DCTP for having produced that roadmap, because I think it's very important. And as a regulator, I would say first it's a wake-up call. It's raise awareness of the topic. We have become, especially in high-income countries, as was said by many of the panelists and the speakers, we've become too complacent. We have become asleep about TB, because it may not be such a problem. It's not actually true, but the feeling that it's sort of away from us. And if we have learned anything from COVID, it shows that a global mobilization is able to solve many problems. So we need to take that lesson and use it for TB. This is maybe more silent, less visible, but still a big killer. So the second thing I would say is very important is the clarify the priorities. You have identified 3 priorities. For us, it's very helpful. When we work on unmet needs and we open our incentive or support to a product, we want to know that we're doing that for the product that have more chances of success, but also more chances of meeting the unmet needs. We welcome the fact that there is funding for research, because clearly one thing that is missing for this particular disease is more understanding of how the immunity works and how we can vaccinate people to be effective and go beyond what the BCG has brought to the situation. And fourth, I would like to also say that this is important to have a tool that I can share. And in particular at EMA, we are currently leading the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities. And there is a big topic on antimicrobial resistance. Of course, TB, multi-drug resistant TB is one of the topics, but we can bring this to say, this is next to it and we need to address it. As regulators together, we need to collaborate. There are guidelines from WHO, but we need to work on what would be the criteria for a new vaccine. If we follow these priorities, how do we prepare for the trials that will come? How do we agree as regulators? Our requirements may be slightly different sometimes from other healthcare professionals, but the trials need to meet our requirement for the product to be approved. We're only a small cog, but if the product is not approved by regulators, it will not be put on the market. It will not be financed. So this is quite essential in itself. And I will stop here. Over.
Thank you very much, Agnès. So as we move over to the second question for our panel, can I encourage folk to think about questions for the Q&A session at the end? And can I ask, please, that when you post a question, if you could indicate which member of the panel who should answer that question. So our second question then is what are the suggestions in relation to future work and collaborations needed to achieve the goals set in the roadmap? And this is the issue of implementation that has come up and it has been raised by several of the speakers so far. So Videlis, can I ask you to kick off from the researcher community perspective?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Yeah, so for future work and collaborations, I think it's good that this platform creates an opportunity for networking scientists and organizations developing TB vaccine candidates with potential trial sites or sites that are experienced in TB vaccine research. And I think this kind of networking will ensure very upfront creation of a technical competency, create a mobilization and access to community networks, because community buy-in is very key in conducting this type of studies. And they also allow the sites to develop the necessary recruitment strategies and diversify stakeholder engagement, because sometimes if people from the Ministry of Health or from the TB control program don't buy in, the process cannot succeed. And in the process also develop capacity for all the way from early phase trials up to very large scale phase 3 licensure trials, and the necessary clinical and the laboratory infrastructure that will be needed to conduct this type of studies. I think in tandem, this can include identifying a wide array of clinical trial sites. And part of that assessment can include looking at their laboratory and clinical infrastructure, the ability to identify, to isolate and collect high quality immunology specimens like peripheral blood mononuclear cells, PAX gene for DNA, for genetic studies, and also ensure that these sites exist in adequate numbers in high burden settings for when we need to move into licensure trials. We'll need a lot of participants and enrollees to be able to demonstrate efficacy. And then also want to get into enabling conditions. I think potential funders should really try and invest in clinical site infrastructure. I know EDCTP has done this substantially, and they also try to support acquisition of epidemiological data that would guide future trials and enable quality specimen collection, formation of biobanking, biobanks that would form future studies for correlates of protection and correlates of risk, and also make sure that the assessment of efficacy endpoints would be high quality. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Fidelis. Let's move on then. Anne, can you give us your thoughts? How do we make this happen?
Thanks, Mark. Great question. I don't know that I have the answer any better than anybody else, but I can tell you about some of the future work, at least that we're prioritizing at the foundation to accelerate TB vaccine development. And it starts with really accelerating and enhancing the portfolio of next generation TB vaccine candidates. So not sitting still with M72 and BCG Revax, as important as we think they'll be, but really trying to leverage the learnings and the platforms from COVID and from everywhere else to try to develop a really robust portfolio of candidates that someday will do even better than the current vaccines. And, you know, that requires lots of things, right? It requires head-to-head testing of those candidates, optimized animal models, lots of collaboration models. We can talk about collaboration more in a minute. And then simultaneously, we think it's important to support sort of the leading preclinical candidates, such as CMV TB or the new mRNA TB candidates that are coming, so that we're sure the pipeline keeps moving. And then finally, in parallel with all of that, supporting late stage development of the key candidates of M72, AS01E, and BCG revaccination. And I think really importantly, leveraging those programs and the biospecimens that have been collected in the efficacy trials for them to date to try to identify correlates of protection, because that's certainly one of the tools that really could accelerate development if we're lucky enough to be able to identify ones that work across platforms especially. And all of those priorities, I think, are in alignment very well with the roadmap action lines. So I think we're all singing from the same hymn book there. In terms of collaborations, again, there's lots to learn, as Helen Reese and others all day have been saying from the COVID experience. I think it's terrific that the WHO is developing a global value proposition for TB vaccines, which will help make the case, and then we can all sort of use that document to try to broaden the base of potential funders, as well as get countries and end users and the final decision makers sort of understanding why it's so important to not only develop these candidates, but ultimately to adopt them and implement them. I also think along those same lines that it's terrific that EDCTP and AIGHD are working with the WHO on a complementary vaccine roadmap that'll focus on sort of from licensure to implementation, because that's as badly needed as the R&D roadmap itself. And together, they really will enable sort of all the broader communities in the world to see that there really is a clear path, if we can just implement it, of getting from discovery all the way out, not to have these vaccines sitting on a shelf somewhere, but all the way out to use, to implementation. So we need, funders as well as others to come together and enable all of these. Some of the enabling conditions then and areas of collaboration. And this has been happening amongst funders and journals and academic institutions to really make open access publishing much more viable and easy, I think, for the scientists to take part in, as well as putting together the sort of conditions for biospecimen sharing, data sharing directly, et cetera. And all of those help to accelerate the research. And it's certainly an area for collaboration that'll be critical. As you all know, late stage development of TB vaccines is incredibly expensive, quite a bit more expensive even than late stage trials for vaccines like COVID, where the infection is acute. You have very high incidence in lots of places around the world at once, and you can conduct those trials with, you still need big numbers, but certainly much more rapidly and in many more places than it's feasible to conduct late stage TB vaccine efficacy trials. So it's absolutely going to take collaborations amongst funders to fund late stage development, particularly as we hopefully will have more than one candidate in late stage development at a time. And that's also going to require flexible and innovative funding mechanisms, and not just the push mechanisms, many of which I think already exist, but really the pull mechanisms to make vaccines attractive to the private sector, to pharma, to the vaccine sponsors, the developers, and the manufacturers. And so to ensure true end-to-end development all the way through adoption and uptake, the global health community, and that includes funders, governments, and all the key stakeholders, really need to create a sustainable model for financing global health vaccines that don't on their own have financially attractive markets. You know, COVID vaccine development would never have moved this fast if the private pharmaceutical sector weren't jumping in, you know, in droves, right? And with many of their own resources brought to the table. And that doesn't happen for diseases like TB because there's not the same ultimate financial market. So, you know, I'm not an economist. I don't know how to do this, but I think that idea of having a sustainable market, a sustainable model for financing global health vaccines that don't have attractive markets of their own is really going to be critical and is clearly going to require input and commitment from governments as well as many other stakeholders. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Anne. So we'll now move on to Gisa. So Gisa, from the perspective of the WHO and policymakers, what future work and collaborations are needed to achieve the roadmap goals?
Thanks, Mark, and great points from Anne. I think, you know, it's come up already in this meeting. I think there are comments on it in the chat. William alluded to it. You know, the world is a very different place now to when this roadmap was initiated. And I think we're all really scratching our heads thinking about how we move TB vaccine development forward in the same way as has been done for COVID in the last 12 months. You know, whether that's through novel antigen platforms, manufacturing platforms, regulatory mechanisms, innovative trial designs, novel financing mechanisms. I think that's something that we're going to have to continue to keep looking at and trying to leverage. But I think whether it's a M72 or an mRNA-based TB vaccine that comes to the fore, one of the questions I think that we can try to address in more detail now is, what does the pathway after licensure look like? Can we do some additional work to map out the granularity of that pathway to ensure that we really do accelerate not only licensure, but then actual uptake and use of these vaccines? And I think, you know, beyond that licensure stage, there are a number of different other stakeholders that come into view. So we know that for vaccines that are intended for use in low-income countries, they're very often financed by Gavi. And in order for a Gavi financing, they need a WHO policy recommendation and they need pre-qualification. So one of the questions we would like to really try to get our arms around in more detail is, what are the different data and evidence expectations for regulatory approval, which is, as Agnes pointed out, is absolutely crucial, and what is needed for WHO policy recommendation, pre-qualification and financing, because those are going to differ. And we need to understand what those look like now so that we can start, as Anne has made the point, to think about how we actually resource those and we don't have a delay post-licensure. So kind of as a concrete activity, I guess, I can just share one of the things we are initiating at WHO, which is to develop a preferred policy profile for vaccines intended for use in adults and adolescents. And really this is attempting to bring together developers, regulators, policymakers at the country level, financing agencies to begin to map out what that data path, that evidence path looks like. So we've just initiated this. It'll run through the course of this year, but we hope that will bring greater clarity actually to what additional information is needed, and that will help with this question of an investment case so that we can provide more certainty in terms of what is actually needed for vaccine uptake post-licensure. I think really the other thing just to say is to echo what Anne said, that the continued consultation and alignment across all stakeholders is really going to be crucial as we move forward, and we need the mechanisms to ensure that that takes place. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Geeta. So let's move on then to Rajinder. Rajinder, from the point of view of manufacturers, what needs to be done to achieve the roadmap's goals?
Thank you, Mark. I'll be brief. In fact, the roadmap now has been launched. So I think this is high time now that we start engaging, as Jersing was saying, that we should start engaging with all stakeholders. And I would say that, specifically Gavi and CEPI maybe are a few agencies where we should start getting in contact with, and also start identifying potential manufacturers who would be interested in taking up TB vaccine and licensing, and then making it available to the people who really need it. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Rajinder. And then finally, Agnes, moving onto the regulatory perspective, what needs to be done and what collaborations are needed to move ahead?
So as I said earlier, there is one level which is a global level. How can regulators work together to try to identify the best pathway, the best agree some markers, some biomarkers, agree the endpoints, and work with the developers to make sure that there is alignment. There is one single plan, that no need for having difference between regions or countries. That would be the worst. And I think scientific advice is really, and I'm also answering the question which is in the Q&A at the same time. Scientific advice is a way forward. We have already a platform where people can come at no cost and discuss innovation, and so they can come at any time when they already have ideas and they want to explore their ideas to see if regulators would be open to such work. So very early in the development, there is also scientific advice, which is a more formal procedure. It attracts the fees, but because of the unmet needs, because of the possibly also because of who is asking the question. If it's an academic, for example, we would lower the fee or waive the fee depending on the situation. So we can encourage people to come to us and discuss. And both at EMA, at FDA, in other areas, we will be absolutely happy to discuss early. Come as early as phase 1, discuss your plans. Don't wait until you've done the trial to discuss with regulators, because if they tell you this is not the way you should have done it, then it's a waste of a patient or participant. It's a waste of resources, the waste of your time, and maybe a waste of years for a patient to access a new active vaccine. So come early and come often. This is really what, if I have one message over for the whole panel, for me, this is come to the regulators, come often. And I really want to say that we are more and more working together. I think COVID has also had a very positive effect on international collaboration. We have learned to work effectively together, not just to exchange what we are doing on our side. We actually work. And to give you a recent example, we have now invited 5 WHO and 4 countries to join the work of the CHMP at EMA. They can contribute actively to the evaluation. They can take part of the evaluation for them. It's called open, and they can interact with us on COVID, on the vaccine, and on the treatment. And that allows, that as is the basis actually, this collaborative work has been the basis for the EUL for the AstraZeneca vaccine. So it does deliver. When regulators work together, it does deliver. So that would be for me the main point. Global collaboration through ICMRA and other fora, but also at regional or national level, engaging with developers to advise them to make sure that they do the right trial from the outset. Over.
Thanks very much, Agnes. We are coming towards the end of the session. I think we have time for one quick question, and the question that I can see there probably does not have a short answer. Gita from Abu Bakr Hoza asks, how is WHO prepared to address issues of safety and intellectual property right issues, which is something we have not discussed much in this session, to ensure TB vaccine affordability and equitability to developing countries. Have you got a comment?
I don't have a short answer, Mark. I think it's a really important question. I think this falls into the bracket of one of the late stage activities that we need to be preparing for now, and how do we get a grasp on this as things move towards licensure in order to ensure that we have access to these vaccines and that we have a healthy market for manufacturers. So it's a crucial question, and I don't have the answer, but I think it should be part of this roadmap analysis. Agreed. Thanks very much. So thank you to the panelists. I think this has been a great session. Certainly from the panelist perspective, from their various stakeholder communities, we seem to have a very clear idea of where the roadmap fits in and the way forward. For the rest of us, we have a roadmap. It remains for us simply to walk the road and use the map, and to do that together. So in closing then, I'll ask Dr. Michael Makanga, Executive Director of EDCTP, to give us his thoughts and close the meeting. Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark. I want to take this opportunity to extend my thanks to the co-chairs of this session, all speakers and panelists that have contributed immensely to the success of this meeting. I want to thank especially Frank Hovellens and all the team members at the Amsterdam Institute for Global Health and Development, the colleagues at EDCTP that have worked tirelessly to make this a success, and to all of you and the representatives of the
Michael, we're losing your audio there intermittently.
That have, as has been clearly indicated, this is and has clear upon you to use it. As we've heard from the representatives from the research community, from the funders community, from WHO and policy, from the manufacturers and product developers, from the regulatory perspectives, this is indeed a document that has utility. Make use of it. We've been challenged that it is one thing to develop the roadmap and it's another to have its implementation. We cannot have a single implementation. Stakeholders make use of it and appropriate it to your strategies so that you fulfill the actions, the concrete actions that have been laid out on the research and development, on the diversity of the power of vaccines and increase, as well as the cross-cutting enabling environment. EDCTP is taking it right heads on. Charity begins at home. And on our side, we are already prioritizing funding for, say that looking at our pipeline, looking at the moment is the highest funded disease in our portfolio. And the niche on TB vaccine development forward, even in the future program of EDCTP. And I have to say that the future program of EDCTP also has an orientation of increasing support for late-stage development of clinical trials, as well as product-focused implementation research. And in this case, more funding will be committed to these areas. And we are fully committed to the cross-cutting areas of open science, bi-directional capacity development, and ensuring that we support highly collaborative research and development. And with this, and drawing from the lessons of COVID-19, I want us to all take on the challenge and take this roadmap forward to make it a success. We also know and encourage that this will inform and complement the development of a comprehensive global value proposition for research and development that is being developed by WHO. So with these words, attention. Thank you very much. So with this, we'll now close the meeting, and I thank you for your engagement in this session and committing this time. Let us go forward and make use of this roadmap. Thank you very much.